On this episode of the Soul Twin Stars podcast.
How did you find coming back into your body and back into your earthly life per se, where everything we experience here is quite the opposite of the heaven that you visited?
How can your whole life, every event of your life, be involved in a life review that happens during a 10-minute cardiac arrest?
I thought, wow, what a beautiful sign from the universe that, everything is going to be okay. We just have to love each other and elevate each other and stay positive.
So don't succumb to that little ego voice, but learn to rise above it. Pat it on the back, put it into time out and meditation, but learn that you are much more than that.
Hi, I'm Lady Shadow, a witch with much to share, stirring the cauldron with magical self-care.
Hi, I'm Peaceful Nik, a medium divine. I chat with the dead and interpret every sign.
We are Soul Twin Stars, best friends through it all.
From spells to healing, we're answering the call.
From moon cycles to menopause and making peace with the dead.
We aren't afraid to talk about what's rarely said.
So tune in each week to get raw, real, and wise.
Let's talk about a spiritual life with absolutely no disguise. Welcome to the Soul Twin Stars podcast, Uninhibited Spirituality. Peaceful Nik and Lady Shadow here. We would like to first and foremost thank our sponsors for this episode. Thank you to Nadine Gordon-Taylor, intuitive artist, author, speaker, and teacher. She's also the visionary creator behind a series of soul-stirring oracle decks, including the Animal Love Oracle cards, the Heart Path Oracle, the Crystal Clear Oracle deck, and the highly anticipated Plant Spirits Oracle, arriving this fall of 2025. Her work blends mystical insight with artistic mastery, offering tools that inspire a deep connection and inner wisdom. Explore her full collection at thirdeyestudio.com, THIRDI or experience her magic in person at her beautiful Peekskill, New York storefront, the Third Eye Studio. To purchase her oracle decks, please visit innertraditions.com. Also, thank you to Beans and Buttercream Bakery. Delicious homemade treats shipped anywhere. Call 417-973-2352. And Abernathy Photography, based in southwestern Kentucky, a professional and stellar company providing drone photography in both local and destination weddings. Visit abernathyphotography.com. Author Mary Ray's self-reflection workbook on conquering shame and guilt, Tell the Devil to Go to Hell, an interactive memoir, is available on Amazon.com. Craving delicious Italian cuisine? You can find it right here in Westchester County, New York at Fino Restaurant, that's F-I-N-O, restaurant at One Baltic Place in Croton-on-Hudson, New York. All of our sponsors are linked up on our Soul Twin Stars podcast Facebook page, and we thank them for making this podcast possible. And now, back to our episode.
Nik, welcome back. I mean, here we are recording another podcast. Wow, we're 2 months in.
The day of this recording is 7/7, by the way. And 25, 2 plus 5 is 7.
See, it's always signs. As a spiritual woman and as a witch who's very connected to my Gaia, which is my earth, my organic earth, who I love so much, I'm always looking for ways to not just connect and to manifest that connection, but like you, I'm always testing it and asking and requesting for the connection to show up. That just gives me more faith to go through every day knowing that there's something out there helping and watching and keeping us accountable into our higher selves, right? And our guest today, Eben Alexander, which if you all have not heard, a neurosurgeon that had an after-death experience that was absolutely phenomenal and changed his entire view on life and medicine and physics and spirituality, just ties in the fact that we all need to feel not just connected to each other, but to our higher selves. And when it goes beyond that, that there's a collective of really loving beings that want to be part of executing our lives and our desires is really special. So I'm always out, like I tell you, Nik, right? Looking at the sky. At night, I'm a night owl. So 2, 3 a.m., if I'm up, I go out barefoot and lock myself on that soil. And I ask for signs and I get them all the time. And I'm sure you do as well. And just knowing when those signs come in, and they come in through weather phenomena, they come in through shooting stars. So I see these things called flashers, right? And I don't know if anyone else sees this. And it's generally when I'm super paying attention and have a lot of energy, and I simply just request some kind of proof that, hey, show up for me in that beautiful sky. Show up for me in the moment of a weakness or a moment of needing strength or healing. So the other night, I'm out with my husband again, watching the sky at 2 a.m. And I said, show yourselves, everyone, whether it's a divine being or an extraterrestrial. I'm open to anything. Show yourselves. And then I get these little flashers, and I've been seeing them over the years, a couple of times a year. Sure enough, I'm staring at a cluster of stars, and I'm staring at the blackness in the middle of the cluster of stars. And sure enough, like a flashlight, star sized, turns on and turns off. That's what it did. There was nothing in that black space, and this bright little light turns on like a star. Oh, I didn't see that star before. Wait, no, I'm looking at black, and then it just turns itself off just like that. And what the hell is that? I don't know, but I feel like when I ask and I look and I receive, I don't have to know the why or how. I just have to know I'm grateful, and it's clearly something communicating with me from beyond, watching and always guiding. It's amazing. I'm overwhelmed with joy and gratitude, and it just gives me that little oomph to get through the next day or the next week that I know is going to be lots of earthly solutions and problems to be facing. You know how that goes?
Yep, there's always something coming, no matter how centered or peaceful or in what meditative state we seem to be in. There's always something else coming up behind it. That's why it's so important to stay grounded and put your feet in the soil like you did and communicate with the universe and ask for signs. It is a beautiful, beautiful way to navigate your life, to realize I have to be prepared in every way I can. And I think it's wonderful that you have those experiences.
And you do too. So tell us about your favorite connection to phenomena and weather and all things ethereal.
So, yesterday I was having a family day with my youngest son and daughter-in-law, and we were driving, and there had been a storm, and there were some clouds, and in the rear view mirror, my daughter-in-law was like, "Oh my God, Nik, do you see that rainbow?" And I couldn't see it because it was behind us. And I looked in the rear view mirror, and it was the brightest, most vivid rainbow I've ever seen in my life. And it was fully across the sky,
Oh,
fully.
I love those.
It was the brightest violet I've ever seen in a rainbow. And I look at the sky all the time. As you were mentioning, I do the same thing. I go outside. If anybody follows my Instagram stories, you see my pictures of the sky constantly. And I actually put some of these on there. And I thought, wow, what a beautiful sign from the universe that, everything is going to be okay. We just have to love each other and elevate each other and stay positive. And I want to talk about what a rainbow is as an analogy to following a spiritual life. So there are people who are called materialists. Those are scientists and humans who just believe in what you see, feel, hear, and touch, right? But rainbows exist. Everybody can see rainbows, but you can't touch it. It's not really real.
You also can't harness it.
You cannot harness it, correct? You cannot put a rainbow in a box, right? You move to a certain angle and the rainbow's not there, but you move to another angle and the rainbow is there. And so this is analogous to a spiritual path, right? Not everybody can see, feel, hear, and touch a spiritual life. They think it may be woo woo or, oh, that's too weird or you're weird or, I can't tell you how many times I've been called weird in my life.
That's a compliment to us.
I know. Weird people are the best. But so the rainbow is almost like an optical illusion, but our spiritual path is just as real as a rainbow is because you audience or somebody listening who may have some opinions about a spiritual path, you can't see, feel, hear, or touch my spiritual journey, but it is my journey and it is extremely important to me. And it's something I experience. Just like you experience a rainbow from one angle, but not another angle. So we are all on our path, whether someone else can see it from their perspective or not, or believe it from their perspective or not. A rainbow exists, and so does each individual's spiritual journey. And I think it's beautiful that we can all carve out our own path. And it's important to understand that each of us individually explore this in the time we are supposed to explore it. And it's an individual path that we all have to think about when it's right for us.
I love that. And you know what else? You can apply that to almost anything. People are always stuck in the, oh, if I did this, oh, if I had just done this quicker, earlier, faster. But honestly, everything happens for a reason. There can't be a mistake, even though it feels like a mistake, even if it's repeated, even if it's behavior that, well, you don't call a mistake, you call a purposeful bad decision or a risky decision, and you do it anyway, still doesn't matter. It's all a learning curve, and it's all on its own time. And I'm not saying that fate is predestined to lay out what you did is what you were supposed to do. But I am saying that what you choose and what you do is part of the journey, all of it, the missteps and the successes and the timing of things. And if we just trust that even the missteps and the betrayals and the questionings, if we just trust that everything has its right time, there'll be no room for the self-punishment, because now you're already living in the past when we should be living in the present. And that just reminds us to just keep going forward with no regrets, even though we all have them, and understand that the present is all that really the spiritual world remembers, and the past is just somewhere else on the timeline, gone, and you don't have to reference it anymore.
There are no wrong decisions in general, right?
Exactly.
Everything is going to lead us to where we're supposed to be. The universe is going to reroute us to where we're supposed to end up. And
Yes.
that is the nature of our life. That is the choices we made in our soul contract, if you believe in something like that, which we talk about with the incredible, wonderful Dr. Eben Alexander, who is our guest today on the Soul Twin Stars podcast.
And I think I hear him knocking. He is here. He is ready. Take it away, Nik.
Today, we are absolutely honored to have Dr. Eben Alexander as our guest. Dr. Alexander was an academic neurosurgeon for over 25 years, including 15 years at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, Children's Hospital, and Harvard Medical School in Boston. In 2008, he experienced a transcendental near-death experience during a week-long coma from an inexplicable brain infection that completely transformed his worldview. A pioneering scientist and modern thought leader in the emerging science that acknowledges the primary of consciousness in the universe. He is the author of the New York Times #1 bestseller, Proof of Heaven, The Map of Heaven, and Living in a Mindful Universe. Welcome, Dr. Alexander. We are honored to have you here with us.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on today. It's great to have a chance to chat with you.
Wonderful. I would like you to briefly tell us about your NDE, and then we're going to go into some really interesting questions today.
Okay, that sounds great. I'll keep it very brief. The important things to the scientific community and to me as a neuroscientist, neurosurgeon who spent pretty much a lifetime studying the brain-mind connection. The important thing was that my brain was so inactivated by the E. coli bacterial meningoencephalitis that afflicted me for a week, threw me deep into coma for a week, that there really was no place in that brain for a dream or hallucination to happen. It turns out there was a medical case report on my medical records. It was written by 3 doctors not involved in my care, but fascinated by my recovery. And that appeared in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, September 2018. And in fact, they make the case very clearly that my Glasgow coma scales, the CT and MRI evidence that no part of my neocortex was unscathed, it really calls into question the dominant kind of neuroscientific materialist view that the brain creates consciousness. Because in fact, I had a much richer form of consciousness when my brain was very much inactivated. And that was a very challenging thing to understand. And that's, in fact, when the peer review editors, scientific editors of that journal challenged the authors of that paper, how do you explain his recovery? Because, it's unprecedented in the medical literature to have somebody that ill from bacterial meningoencephalitis to then make a full recovery. They said it's because he had a near-death experience. That was the scientific explanation for why this kind of thing could happen. They knew of other cases of severe illness, like, for example, Anita Morjani, who had an advanced lymphoma, which was cured by her NDE, or Dr. Mary C. Neal, who had an over 30-minute warm water drowning, kayaking in Chile. And, ask any doctor what your brain is like after more than 30 minutes under warm water. It's mush, you're not coming back. And yet in these cases, these deep spiritual journeys seem to be associated with profound healing. Now, in my own case, again, extremely briefly, there were 3 phases I went through: a primitive course, Earthworm Eye View, then a very rich, kind of ultra detailed and ultra real Gateway Valley. That's where I met my beautiful guardian angel, whose identity I only discovered 4 months after my coma. All of that is a story told in Proof of Heaven, but ultimately, it challenged everything that I thought I knew in terms of brain creates consciousness, the conventional view of modern science. And I have to reject that model. It just doesn't work. The brain is not the creator of consciousness. It's a filter. It's a transceiver. It allows access to consciousness and to memory, but it is not the ultimate producer of all that. And this was the deep and profound lesson that I went through, that the modern scientific community is going through because of thousands or millions of these kind of cases. And we come to realize that our soul is eternal, that in many ways we become much more aware when we leave the physical body at the time of bodily death. And so this is where, almost 17 years after my near-death experience, I find myself, and I'm in work with scientists around the world who are studying the depths of kind of these mysteries of human experience, and realizing that we have to have a much bigger model for the nature of consciousness. It appears much more unified. And so that's what I discovered on my big journey. And in fact, I mentioned Earthworm Eye View and then the beautiful ultra real Gateway Valley. But beyond that was a realm that I call the core, which is a complete resolution of all oneness. It's where I came to recognize that my very conscious awareness was directly sourced in that God mind at the core of the universe that, many other near-death experiences have witnessed over thousands of years. It turns out that more than 90% of NDEers come back not only believing, but knowing in a powerful, benevolent, intelligent force at the core of the universe. And I discovered on my journey that it's irrelevant whether you're trying to label that force God or Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit. They all are referring to the same very powerful and yet loving and deeply personal kind of source of consciousness in this universe, that God force. And the rest of the scientific community is slowly kind of waking up to the profound implications of this kind of unity of consciousness, and the fact that the brain is more of a prison or shackles than something that produces consciousness. And that's where the possibilities are greatly expanded in terms of free will, in terms of our influence on our emerging reality. And that was really the main impact of my own near-death experience, was that scientific truth of this kind of broad concept of the unity and connection of mind. That we're all brought together through the forces, binding forces of love. That's ultimately the message of NDEs.
It's the highest vibration, it's the highest frequency. And I love that. And as someone myself with a scientific background, working in science, communication, education, and research for over 20 years, I became a medium later in life, shockingly, never expected it to happen. And so I've been on this quest to prove that science proves mediumship is real. And I don't know if quantum physicists are aware that they are proving that the afterlife is real. So I would like to ask you that about exactly what you were just talking about. The universe is more interconnected than classical science, materialist science allows. There's so much more, and how egotistical of us to believe that it's just what we see, feel, hear, and touch, right? There is so much more, and your experience validates that. How do you think quantum mechanics might one day provide a framework for understanding the continuity of consciousness after physical death?
Well, first of all, I will point out that there are physicists interested in quantum physics who have definitely come down very strongly aligned with this notion of primacy of mind. One of the first that I know of was Roger Penrose. He actually won a Nobel Prize in physics years after his admission of the relationship of kind of deep physics and consciousness. His book, The Emperor's New Mind, which I think was out in 1989, was a profound example of how mind is much more than something that can simply be reduced to the workings of the brain. Turns out that in 1975, there had been a wonderful book by a neuroscientist, a neurosurgeon, Wilder Penfield, renowned Canadian neurosurgeon, who had done more work stimulating the brain in awake patients than just about any other neurosurgeon of the era. And that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where you start to really get at phenomenal experience of mental contents compared with what's going on in the brain. And he was stimulating the brain in awake patients. I've done hundreds of those operations myself. So I know exactly how all of that works. I defer to Penfield analysis in 1975 in his book, The Mystery of the Mind, where he makes it very clear that materialist science and neuroscience and all our neurosurgical techniques are far too inadequate to more fully investigate the nature of consciousness. And in fact, he said that he could have a great kind of knowledge and belief and knowing in kind of the spiritual nature of humans through his own experimentation that proved that you cannot reduce all this to the workings of the brain. And that's what opened up this much richer discussion. But sadly, the world was not ready for that deep message in 1975. And they certainly were much more ready when I wrote the book Proof of Heaven in 2012. And there's a group of scientists around the world. I mentioned Roger Penrose. There are several others of note. Meningitis is one. Bernard Carr, who is Stephen Hawking's last kind of doctoral candidate. And Bernard Carr is a brilliant physicist, but he's worked deeply with higher dimensional realities, which is a wonderful way to start approaching these different mental spaces and how they intersect with our presence in these physical bodies, but show an extension of knowledge, telepathy, remote viewing, the mediumistic readings. To my knowledge, these have all been proven beyond any reasonable doubt scientifically. And so this primacy of consciousness is something that many scientists certainly get. And I would say in many ways, quantum physicists were the first people to recognize that what we were trying to call this mental experience, or kind of the epistemological experiencing of an ontological world out there, was not so simple as to simply say that the mind results from the workings of the brain in the physical world. That didn't work. And so you need a bigger model. And that's where people like Bernard Carr, Roger Penrose, Meningitis, and others, Brian Josephson, another Nobel laureate, has also written extensively about the kind of connection of consciousness with modern physics. And I would say that quantum physics really opened the door to it. It's mainly that when you look at the world around us, and when these quantum physicists looked at the way they were experimenting with photons and quarks and electrons and these various subatomic particles, you realize that those particles that what happened with them depended on the mind and the choices of the observer. As Pascual Jordan, a famous quantum physicist, said, our observations not only reveal reality, but they create it. And that's exactly what quantum physicists saw going on. Now, it turns out that it took the rest of the scientific world a bit longer to accumulate enough data to prove the case for the afterlife. But for example, there's a great resource right now for all of your readers where you can come to prove to yourself that the afterlife has been scientifically validated beyond any reasonable doubt. That's bigelowinstitute.org. The Bigelow Institute essays were written 4 years ago in a contest sponsored by Robert Bigelow, an aerospace engineer who had lost his wife. His son had committed suicide. He wanted to know, is there any reality to scientific support for this afterlife idea? And he originally was going to give out prizes for 3 monetary awards. The essays from all over the world were so good, he gave out 29 monetary awards. Those essays are all available for the reading public at no charge. bigelowinstitute.org. Start reading, for example, Jeffrey Mishlov's first place essay, and you'll quickly realize that we've moved beyond the fact of doubting the scientific support of the afterlife. We now have that evidence. It's deep and it's profound, but if you start reading those essays, you'll quickly realize it's established beyond any reasonable doubt. And that includes not only essays on parapsychological topics, like Mishlov's essay depends a lot on that, but also some purely scientific essays like Bernardo Kastrup's paper on idealism. He won one of those Bigelow essays. Pim van Lommel, the renowned Dutch cardiologist who wrote a beautiful kind of world-changing paper in the esteemed scientific journal Lancet in 2001 on a 20% incidence of near-death experiences in cardiac arrest patients studied prospectively in the Netherlands. And so all of these different pieces of evidence, all very scientific, and you'll realize we've already gotten to that point. We need better theoretical models for how it all works, but ultimately idealism, primacy of consciousness, panentheism, the notion of a unified consciousness in that God mind that kind of permeates all of reality, are very different from panpsychism. Panpsychism is a pseudo-materialist philosophical position that I think is totally weak, has nothing to really support it, and yet that's where some materialists are forced to go when they realize that materialism fails at explaining consciousness. So anyway, the game has changed, and we now have tremendous evidence. And in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, Karen Newell and I really went the distance far beyond where I could go in Proof of Heaven and the Map of Heaven. But in Living in a Mindful Universe, it came out in 2017. We talk about quantum physics. We talk about neuroscience, the hard problem of consciousness. We talk about philosophy of mind and the binding problem, and also all the evidence for non-local consciousness out of parapsychology, remote viewing, telepathy, things like that. And you start to realize that the evidence is overwhelming for this deeper, more profound reality. And it's really the saving grace for humankind, because the false sense of separation that is so inherent in materialism is what has led to so much of the damage and threat to our modern world in terms of potential nuclear war, other major conflicts, violence against others, reckless disregard for the environment with our addiction to fossil fuels and heating up the planet. All these things are part of that false sense of separation of materialism, especially combined with a very warped view of Darwinian evolution that focused on competition and didn't realize that collaboration and cooperation are the main ingredients to success in the living kingdoms. So bottom line is, primacy of mind reawakens our ability to understand our free will and its ability to influence the emerging reality we see in this universe. And NDEs are the tip of the spear in educating us about this far grander potential for self, when we realize the little ego mind, that little voice in our head, is not truly who we are. We are far grander beings than that. And meditation is my suggestion to people who need to figure this out on their own: meditation, centering prayer, modes of going within on a regular basis. And anybody who needs a tool for meditation, I recommend Sacred Acoustics. That's what I use. You can learn a lot more at sacredacoustics.com. It's a form of binaural beat brainwave entrainment. But I find it to be extremely powerful and something I've used an hour to a day for the last 11 or 12 years. And it's helped me return not only to my NDE, but to come to a much richer identification of kind of my higher soul through relationships with the various kind of guides and information sources I first encountered during my near-death experience.
Meditation is so important. I agree. I started doing meditation for non-meditators every Monday on my YouTube channel. So we need to raise the vibration. There's so much negativity, and I agree with so much of what you just said. I'm going to have to listen to this 50 times to decipher all of it and get all those names, because some of them I'm familiar with and some of them I need to do research on. I have one follow-up question before Lady Shadow gets to her question. I believe, with my astronomy background and my connection to the stars, we are all made of recycled stardust, right? Every atom and molecule in our body comes from a star that exploded billions of years ago. And because of quantum entanglement, I think this may be why the collective consciousness works. Our body is literally made up of stars that exploded from all across the universe. So it makes sense to me, if I'm made up of trillions of atoms, that I can be interconnected with someone in another galaxy across the universe and communicate in that way.
General concept, I think, in science is called entanglement.
Yes, yes.
Entanglement is how subatomic particles can be revealed to have a connection that bypasses the standard kind of channels of space-time for
Right.
information transfer. And the whole universe basically came together out of that Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. And so in many ways, you could see how all of this can be entangled. It all originated, in one point. And when I say all that, I'm not ignoring the fact that I believe the actual universe has been infinite, and that the Big Bang was only a local operation, where a local kind of island of the universe kind of emerged with its own physical laws, its own time flow, et cetera. And that's what we're living in and observing. But I think the entire universe is far grander than that. But
I believe in the
to say that what we can observe shows us that our pocket of the universe began 13.8 billion years ago, and it all ultimately came out of one point. So to surmise that things are entangled is certainly a great possibility. Now, many physicists would complain because they would say that to preserve information content in a quantum system, decoherence is a big problem. And that's when the quantum system becomes, interactive with other things around it. And like, especially in the warm, wet brain. Early arguments from quantum physicists were, these quantum effects we observe, entanglement, superposition, et cetera, they don't really occur in the warm, wet brain because decoherence immediately erases that quantum information. But I think that's ignoring the kind of deeper sense of entanglement that we're really kind of pointing to here, and how the universe does offer these channels of communication. And we might say that humans are not wise enough to pass information. That's one of the conclusions when you follow these arguments very deeply, that, because of Einstein's theoretical speed limit for anything traveling in the universe, the fastest particles can travel is the speed of light. That's a massless particle. Anything with mass cannot even go that fast. So, but anyway, the bottom line is that entanglement, in many ways, from my perspective, is really the mental field of the universe. It's a field of information interconnection that we have access to. And it didn't wait for humans to evolve for it to happen. Right. It's been here since before the Big Bang even happened. So that mental phase, that kind of entanglement field of the universe, is a very important concept that has to do with our free will and our ability to manifest. You're pointing out all the material, of physical stuff that we can point to in the universe. And interestingly, there's also a kind of a quantum foam of virtual particles that are, coming into existence and then annihilating each other, quadrillions of times all throughout this universe. Those are really from a field of potential. That's more of the entanglement field. that really opens up to allowing us to create our emergent reality. And I think humans have access to that by having access to this primordial mind. And it really is a mind over matter, spirit over matter situation. And the materialist science that I worship before my coma, I do not use that term lightly. That materialist science would scoff at you for even claiming to have free will, because it says, oh, it's all just chemical reactions, electron fluxes in the brain. Where in the world would you inject free will without violating laws of conservation of energy? Well, it turns out John C. Eccles, Australian neurophysiologist who won a Nobel Prize for his work on neurons, on synaptic channels and vesicles, et cetera, in 1962, he wrote a book called How the Self Controls Its Mind, which completely debunked that notion that conservation of energy laws would prevent free will from influencing the substance of the brain. So it's a beautiful book. I highly recommend it. But ultimately, neurons are quantum computers, and there's top-down causality that allows kind of a confluence of influence from that one mind onto emergent events. And that's where this kind of deeper understanding of the mind is so important. It's where I often get into big discussions of the life review in NDEs, because the life review really shows you how far we need to go to adjust this model so that it will actually fit reality. But it's one that involves the ability to acknowledge that people can have a life review, and 1/3 of them, in Bruce Grayson's series of 700 life reviews reported in fall of 2021, 1/3 of them said their whole life was involved. How can your whole life, every event of your life, be involved in a life review that happens during a 10-minute cardiac arrest? The reason is because when you're in that realm, you're in a timeless realm. Birth, death, everything in between, all of it can be seen simultaneously, including past lives, including potentials for future lives. I do not believe that the future is predetermined, but I think there are pathways forward that can be delineated. In fact, I'm a strong believer that our souls and soul groups kind of plan on the challenges and hurdles of a given incarnation. I learned from my NDE that one of the biggest gifts in life are the hardships and challenges we face, because it's how we deal with them that actually allows for transformation and growth of the soul. And I believe we actually choose some of those choice points, and that all that alters as we go, as the soul goes through life and is through this process of growing, maturation, understanding as a group. We end up kind of following those pathways and coming to acknowledge. I realized that many of the hardships in my life, for example, I was put up for adoption by my birth mother when I was 11 days old, failure to thrive. And, for much of my life, I looked back on that dark smoking crater, my adoption abandonment wound, and thought it was a bad thing. But in my NDE, especially with finding out the identity of my guardian angel, that was an absolute mind blower. I didn't even figure that out until 4 months after my NDE, as is explained in the book Proof of Heaven. But what an incredible kind of revelation that was. And it brought me back together. And I gained healing from that abandonment wound from my mother. Now, I'd met my birth family a year before my coma. I found out 8 years before my coma that my birth mother and father had gotten married. I cannot tell you what a shock that was. That story is all there in Proof of Heaven. But it sent me into a dark night of the soul, because the way that story that my birth parents had gotten married and had 3 children got to me was during a 2-minute phone call to a social worker, who then said, but it's not a good time to come back in their lives because your younger sister died 2 years ago. That was in 1998. So it was therefore not a good time. They were still grieving her loss. Anyway, all of this is a very big story to point out that the challenges and difficulties in life can be tremendous gifts. And it's how we learn to adapt and accept all that we can really grow into that knowing.
Thank you so much for your insights, Dr. Alexander. This is absolutely fascinating. After having undergone and experienced everything that you did in a world that was filled with beautiful, unconditional love, perfection, and complete self-acceptance, how did you find coming back into your body and back into your earthly life per se, where everything we experience here is quite the opposite of the heaven that you visited. Here, the ego rules all of our decisions, all of our emotions. And I just want to know how you dealt with getting back into the body and finding that unconditional love again here when you were revived and back to your 9 to 5. And how did you apply a new balance of living, whether it was to your career, your friendships, your relationships? I mean, it must have been really tough.
Well, I can tell you it's been a long, steady process, and it doesn't all happen with the near-death experience because it often takes you decades to assimilate and kind of bring in the new knowledge of an NDE to be reflected in the way you live. So it's been a slow, steady, kind of gradual process, although parts of it were very sudden and complete. Like my knowledge of the oneness of mind and the connection of the binding force of love. Those things were very clear at the outset, but then making sense of them in kind of my scientific mind view is what has been kind of the stepwise and slow and steady program. And that's what has also involved a lot of meditation. As I said, try to meditate an hour or two a day. And I use differential frequency brainwave entrainment, as I mentioned, the binaural beat brainwave entrainment of sacred acoustics. And we discuss in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, a lot about that technique and specifically why it seems to be so powerful, that it's inducing this very powerful left-right oscillation of signal in the lower brainstem. That's how binaural beat brainwave entrainment works. And my first introduction to it was through an article in Scientific American by Gerald Oster. It's called Auditory Beats in the Brain. It's from the early 1970s. And that article I read within about 2 years of my coma, and it made it clear that there were neurophysiologic techniques to kind of shake consciousness free from the normal mode of self here and now into a more timeless zone of the spiritual realm, kind of like hypnagogia, the space between awake and asleep. But this is about intentionally getting to that space, to that kind of vibratory level, where that little voice in your head, as Michael Singer calls it in his book, The Untethered Soul, he calls that voice in your head the annoying roommate. That is the label I want you to keep in mind. That is not your consciousness, not your soul. It's only a parlor trick that's vaguely related to a deeper understanding of the oneness of mind and this connection that we share as higher souls with our fellow beings. And so a lot of the work has involved meditation and coming to deeper realization. I often do a lot of what I call higher soul to higher soul work, which is if I have some kind of conflict or interaction ongoing with somebody else or with some other souls, I go into a higher soul to higher soul mode in deep meditation and try and come out with the best win-win situation for all involved. And it's really always trying to come up with a higher good and not just following the nonsensical demands of your ego, which is deeply tied to things like addiction and life-wrecking phenomena. So don't succumb to that little ego voice, but learn to rise above it, pat it on the back, put it into time out in meditation, but learn that you are much more than that. And that's what we can come into knowing. And that much more is something that involves all of us getting along. It involves putting to work the binding force of love. I often say that deep in the world of NDEs, with NDEs serving as the tip of the spear, is the golden rule. Treat others as you would like to be treated. That's written into the very fabric of the universe in the form of these life reviews. I mentioned earlier that Bruce Grayson, he's a skeptical psychiatrist who studied NDEs for the last 45 years. And in an article he wrote in Journal of Near-Death Studies in the fall of 2021, he talks about 698 life reviews from his thousands of NDE cases. And I said earlier, 1/3 of those people had their whole life involved in the life review. That's a big piece of data right there, that it's not just this is some hallucination or dream state. No, it's not. And not only that, but something like 3/4 of people describe the events, for one thing, as more real than normal earthly events, but also, even more importantly, that they were experienced from the perspective of all involved. So when you have your life review, if you've been handing out pain and suffering to others, been greedy or selfish, in the life review, you're on the receiving end of that. And you see that it doesn't feel so good. And you have to do that for every soul that was impacted by this. So, and if you think that's not possible, you just don't understand what that meant when 1/3 of these people said their entire life was involved in the life review. But the fact that 3/4 of them are harping on the fact that it's from everybody's perspective. If you've handed out a lot of love and kindness and compassion to other beings, that's what comes back to you in your life review. And it's pretty much a green light to move forward in your next lives and incarnations, plans with your soul group, etc. But if you kind of fail miserably and your life review is filled with kind of the trauma and badness you've handed out to other people, you kind of have to go back to square one and go through a lot of those same issues in your next lifetime. I'd rather make progress. And I think most of us would. So acknowledging this kind of bigger reason for existence.
Thank you for that. And continuing on that note, some people think that the light is a soul trap. It's not what we think it is. They think it's a coercion by beings on the other side to encourage us to keep reincarnating based on showing us the life review, only to convince us that we aren't whole as we are. We aren't complete, that we need to continue to suffer over and over again every lifetime in order to pay some kind of, I don't know, karmic debt. But in reality, we know that every time we come down and live a life, we're not going to do it perfectly. No matter how good of a person we are, we will still make mistakes, we will still hurt people, whether accidentally or on purpose, and we'll never live a perfect life. So my question is, if the standard of getting off of the earth plane is good behavior, a better life review than the last, can we just simply opt out of coming back here? Can we just say, no thanks, I want to stay with you all. I feel better up here. Did you feel like you had free will to say, I'd like to go back or I'd like to stay? And was there any coercion? Was there any guilt? Or was there a higher voice or source telling you what you had to do? These were your instructions.
Well, I think I never really kind of finished the details of the end of my NDE. What happened was I was told every time I entered that core realm, that realm of complete oneness, a resolution of all dualities, where I recognize the source of my very conscious awareness as being that God force. And every time I entered that core, I was told, you're not here to stay. We'll teach you many things, but you'll be going back. And then I would cycle back through, starting again at that earth were my view. And by remembering the musical notes of the melody, I could always conjure up the light portals that took me to higher and higher levels through the Gateway Valley again, always with that beautiful guardian angel on the butterfly wing, the spiritual guide who was so important, especially when I found out her true identity 4 months after my coma. But as I said, it all came to an end when at one point I could no longer conjure up the musical notes of that melody to take me up into these higher levels. To say I was sad at that point would be an understatement, but I also knew I could trust that I would be taken care of. I had no doubt about that. And that's when I saw thousands of beings going off around me into the distance, heads bowed, some holding candles. This murmuring energy coming from them was drawing me back, and in a very comfortable way. That was the surprise of it all, was this murmuring energy, even though I was now back down in that kind of murky earth were my view, that energy was very loving and connecting. And I called that in my later writings, weeks later, recording all this, I call that the power of prayer. And it was the 6 faces I saw at the very end that had to do with my return. There were 6 faces of close family and friends, one of my physicians who was also a close friend and neighbor. And those faces would say a few words and then dissolve back in the muck. But it was the last face that got my attention. It was a 10-year-old boy. Now, this was Sunday morning, day 10 of coma. I'd already experienced the vast majority of the spiritual journey. And according to that case report, all that happened between days 1 and 4 or 1 and 5 of my 7-day coma. That's all very important. The timings discussed in the books, Living in a Mindful Universe and Proof of Heaven, because the timing's very important. But it was that last face pleading with me, a 10-year-old boy, and it was my son, Bond. They had protected Bond from the worst news during that week, but on that final Sunday morning, I hadn't shown any signs of neurologic improvement. I've been on a ventilator for a week, and they were talking about taking me off the ventilator. Bond overheard that and knew, it's much worse than they've told me. He came running down the hallway, pulled open my eyelids. They were taped shut, one eye looking there, one eye there, neither pupil working. Anybody in medicine knows it's a horrible picture. And I promise you, I did not see him with my eyes or hear him with my ears. I was far too gone from this world, but I sensed his presence and his pleading with me. Daddy, going to be okay. Daddy, going to be okay, as if somehow that would make it so. So essentially, I'd gone through this entire thing with an amnesia. That's an important ingredient I didn't mention earlier, but I had no memories of Eben Alexander's life. So I couldn't have an Eben Alexander life review, but I did have a very full vision of life reviews and reincarnation in the core realm in two visions. One I call the flying fish, one I call the Ender's Net vision, but they were both very powerful visions that made it crystal clear. Life reviews and reincarnation were part of this big package. But it was that last phase, all the amnesia allowed me to think this can continue, cease, doesn't matter. But now, with that last phase, with Bond and my recognition, my connection to him, even though I didn't recall what a son-father relation was, etc., but boy, I knew I owed him something big, and that's what drew me back to this world. So like so many others, I came back to this world out of a sense of responsibility for another soul. That's what really drove that. But and but so much more of the lesson having to do with oneness of mind, the binding force of love, is stuff that I was still to uncover, not only through the experience itself and reliving it through meditation, but also through advancing and cultivating those relationships with those higher sources of knowledge through ongoing meditation. And that's what I've really put to good use over the years. And that's what's helped me to come into much more alignment with this notion of the oneness of mind, the binding force of love, how we're all truly in this together. And that golden rule is truly written into the fabric of the universe in the form of these life reviews that are not simply vague rememberings or dreamlike. They are absolute relivings of events that can be extremely powerful. And the sooner we come scientifically to an understanding of how that very powerful psychological engine of life reviews and reliving all the events of our lives, and from the perspective of everybody involved, that's when we're starting to truly understand consciousness and the nature of reality.
So there's no ego saying, I want to stay here for me because it's so beautiful here, right? You just
it turns out that we also get the work done here.
Yeah.
We don't get the work done in the spiritual realm. The spiritual realm is where we go through life reviews, review the events of a physical lifetime, plan next events. But that's not, from my perspective, it would be nonsensical to want to stay in that realm forever. And also realize there are other facets of the material realm to enter. I think, coming in on other planets, other civilizations, other kind of levels of development is something that souls do. So we're not limited locally to this Earth existence, although a lot of kind of reincarnation patterns are very similar. They're the village down the road or that kind of thing.
Right. And that's where my question was headed is, if not here, then perhaps we could learn in another civilization or, like you said, another realm, only because Earth tends to have a lot of suffering here, and some of it unnecessarily, some of it by choice, and some of it not by choice. And I think that the hope that when we carry over and visit our guides and beings in a more peaceful, restful place, that we can kind of plan for the next round to be something maybe a little less traumatic than a previous life. And I guess that's why we keep going and experiencing ourselves that way.
I think that's certainly an option, but I've also been amazed at what people look back on as a hardship that then becomes, wow, I'm so glad I went through that because that's what gave me this incredible soul growth. So in other words, I think we're a lot more resilient than you sometimes hear, especially in a very ego-besotted and narcissistic world, which is kind of what this materialist world has degenerated down into. And it's one of the reasons why, I used to look at the 20th and early 21st centuries, these remarkable examples of great scientific wisdom coming to the fore. Well, that's all true to some degree. I mean, when you look at science over the last 150 years, contributions to medicine and healing, contributions to communication, transportation, all of that has been quite remarkable. But there are also there's a dark underbelly to our science. I mean, the very fact that we're now sitting under the dark umbrella of nuclear weapons in a possible World War III, which would be totally unwinnable and unsurvivable, is just insanity that we've gotten to that point. Also, the kind of greed that has allowed scientists, for example, in the oil and coal industries, to pretend that they don't understand one of the most basic principles in science, which is that greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide will heat the planet. I can show
Yeah.
you a paper from 1912 where a scientist said if we keep burning wood and coal the way we are, the planet will heat up. It will become unlivable. That was known, more than a century ago. And yet, the stupidity of greedy scientists who tell a lie, basically to support the fossil fuel industry, is what's getting us into so much trouble. So it's that
Yes.
greed, and it's also kind of the power of modern science. We keep thinking the specialist is going to come rescue us from our own insanity. Well, that's not necessarily true. That's why we need to be the ones to take charge of how this planet works and how resources are used, and quit pretending that we have an infinite piggy bank in the form of planet Earth to just keep ripping resources away and expect that life will be just fine. We have to respect the balance and the symmetry of existence. And that also means not being so demanding about our energy and burning all these fossil fuels and heating the planet up. I mean, the Middle East will be unlivable in the summertime in the next 10 or 15 years. They'll have daytime temperatures in the 140s. So it's not going to be livable. And the same thing in the American West. And the fires will get worse, the floods will get worse. And only a flaming idiot is blind to the ravages of ongoing climate change and how it's destroying this planet. Millions of species are threatened with extinction through the ignorance and aggression of one species, Homo sapiens. Sapiens is wise, but I would say, looking at this picture, we're not entirely wise. But with this kind of evolution of consciousness I'm talking about, that's where I hope we will truly come into wisdom and truly become the stewards of this planetary system that we were meant to be.
I taught environmental science for many years, and I often told my students, we're not destroying the earth, we're destroying the ecosystems humans depend on to survive on this earth. The earth will be fine until the sun swallows it up in 5 billion years. There will be life here, but it's probably not going to be us if we continue down this track. So I agree with that completely. It's ego, it's selfishness, it's money grabbing. It's a whole, that could be a whole other podcast.
Yeah, well, especially with the advent of AI and the
Right.
energy demands of AI. I mean, basically, you do a Google search, that's one thing. If you then do Chat GPT of the same question, it costs 10 times as much energy. So we really need to be much more cautious of AI and where we're letting it lead us. I mean, right now it's more artificial stupidity than anything. It's hallucinations and things like that are just ridiculous. But people, in some sense, I guess, are lazy. So they want the AI to do the work for them, to write their term paper and what have you.
Right.
But ultimately, that kind of cheat is not doing you any good.
In the
this
long
is why
run.
we need to wake up to the bigger picture, be cautious about AI, especially the militarization of AI and the use of kind of autonomous killing machines. That's an extremely dangerous step. So we need to be very careful about how this world proceeds forward with the AI, and its energy use is just the first main complaint I would have about it.
I would like to ask, because as a neurosurgeon, you're around science-minded materialist, I'm sure, often. What is your number one response now that you've had your NDE experience in this profound spiritual awakening? What is your number one response when a materialist scientist gives you pushback on your personal experience?
I simply remind them that I went through this extraordinary experience. And then when doctors who were fascinated by that recovery that seemed miraculous to them went deeply into my medical records, they discovered, this was not just some vague, superficial dive into the coma world with, a little case of meningitis. This was a absolutely should have killed me dynamite case of E. coli bacterial meningitis. My cerebrospinal fluid glucose level, and you or me, the glucose level in our spinal fluid will be 80, 90, something like that. Somebody in deep coma from bacterial meningitis maybe dipped as low as a 20. My glucose level went to 1. None of my consultants up and down the eastern seaboard had ever heard of a meningitis where the bacteria had already consumed all the glucose, and now it was just busy consuming all the brain cells. My neocortex was under attack. And of course, people look at me today and say, well, he can't have been that sick. Look how well he's doing. Well, guess what? I had an NDE. That's the kind of missing link. And until you're willing to admit that major difference between me and the next 1,000 meningitis cases who didn't come back, you start realizing that the NDE can be a very powerful tool. It's our spiritual connection to a higher sense of meaning and purpose. And that's what can lead us to recovery. Mind over matter, spirit over matter, healing, coming into wholeness. These are all similar concepts. And that's what I do these days, working with nursing and physician groups, et cetera, talks to all brands of scientists, all different specialties, et cetera, is trying to help them come to this deeper understanding of how we all have the power to kind of manifest the world of our dreams. And also to remember that physical healing from an illness is not always part of the bigger plan. I mean, none of us is meant to live forever. And this is something I always remind myself going deep into these meditations, that the bigger lesson is really how I can serve the world through a deeper understanding of my own life and the events in my life and kind of grow through that. And that's the kind of message I want to help bring out to others. It's certainly a message that's written very strongly in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. From my perspective, the book Proof of Heaven is a big question mark. It says, oh yeah, so Harvard neurosurgeon can have this experience just like anybody else. But the reality is, to really understand it, we need to look at these experiences very broadly and understand that the individual who has them is the primary beneficiary of any near-death experience. But ultimately, when we study them in large numbers, they can help the world at large. And I know that Ken Ring, for one, others have written about how just knowing about NDEs can help people come into this kind of higher form of existence just through that knowledge. They don't have to have their own NDE, but centering prayer and meditation are important steps in that whole process of understanding.
That's wonderful. We talk about that on our podcast a lot, is how to take our sovereign health holistically, spiritually, how we can heal ourselves. That's a huge part of working through the earthly diseases, the stress of the mind causing diseases, spontaneous healing, and how it's very possible. And like you said, expedited healing, because we are in tune and meditation and in connection with our higher self, which is quantum particles that can spontaneously heal our bodies and our minds, just like in the examples you named before. So it was so important for our audience to know that indeed those work together with traditional medicine, and sometimes not with traditional medicine, that we do have the power in ourselves to keep ourselves healed, whole, and healthy while we are here, so that we can live our higher purpose out.
Well, that's very well put. And I think there's a lot to that. A lot of people have a natural sense that they have that kind of influence over their lives. And yet they wonder, is this scientifically valid? And that's where I would say that those BigelowInstitute.org essay papers help you to go light years towards a deeper understanding of all this. Now, it does get pretty deep, and it does help to be kind of a generalist, not just a specialist in neuroscience, philosophy of mind, parapsychology, quantum physics, but to know enough about all those things to realize how all of them paint one gigantic picture of primacy of mind and the importance of our will as a higher soul in influencing our unfolding reality. And that's where we start to really gain some power in influencing this world. And the more we focus on the higher good, the wholeness and healing and compassion for others, the more successful we are at basically bringing this world into alignment with our higher beliefs. So be very careful what you believe in. Because if you believe none of this is possible, you're going to have great difficulty proving it to yourself. But once you recognize the possibilities and start to realize how all this works through mental manifestation, then focusing on the higher good for all is how you start to achieve the goals of your soul journey.
Love that. Do you have any other questions, Nik?
I think my brain is full of so much knowledge. It's going to take me a month to go through all of this information. I am so grateful for you spreading this information throughout the world, accepting our invitation to appear on our podcast. And it helps every single person. If one person listens or a million people listen, every little bit of information we get out to raise the vibration of humanity, we need it now more than ever, is so
Absolutely.
important.
I agree. Now is the time for all of us to contribute towards saving this beautiful planet that we've been gifted. So rise up to the occasion, get into your meditation and centering prayer, and then start going out and living that life of oneness, compassion, and mercy, and acceptance, when necessary, forgiveness, and never forget gratitude for
Always.
every breath. So,
Absolutely. We are absolutely so honored and privileged to have you here. We will link all of your information into our show notes where everyone can find them, Spotify, everywhere podcasts are found. Thank you so much for your time.
stay in touch through Eben, EBEN Alexander.com, also sacredacoustics.com for the meditations. I can recommend on ebenalexander.com, there's a 33-day journey. First page you get to, click there, leave your name and email address, and every day for 33 days, you'll get an email that's part of a workbook that accompanies our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. But this is all for free. It's a community of more than 12,000 people who've taken that 33-day journey course over the last few years, and they all leave their comments and help each other. So that 33-day journey is a great gift. Also, the recommended reading list, the FAQ page. These are all useful resources at ebenalexander.com, so people can get going with all this.
Wonderful. That is so gracious of you to offer that to the public for free. And thank you, thank you, thank you so much. I've learned so much and I appreciate this so very much. Thank you, Dr.
Well,
Alexander.
thanks for having me on. Great talking with you both.
Many blessings. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us this episode for the Soul Twin Stars podcast. Find us on our podcast Facebook page for Magical Mondays live at 8:30 p.m. Eastern, where we will help you magically slay your weekdays, and for awesome giveaways. For more information about what other spiritual things Nik and I do and offer, visit peacefulnikthemedium.com. That's Nik with just a K. Or to connect with me, Lady Shadow, soulsandspirits.com is the place to go. If you want to be a guest on one of our shows, we would absolutely love that. Contact us at soultwinstars@gmail.com. See you next Friday on Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, Facebook, and on YouTube. Sending you all so many blessings. Thank you so much for joining us, and until next time, know that you are all cherished.